Welcome to the No Limits Leadership Podcast. We discuss ancient wisdom, real-world experiences, and the latest concepts on mastering leadership of self and others. If you're committed to maximizing your life and your impact on the world, you're home. Welcome to the No Limits Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Sean Patton, and I'm very excited to be here with Lantz Howard, executive coach, has a very unique perspective, works primarily with men, but I think that all leaders are going to get a lot out of this conversation. And we met through some mutual coach friends, and I checked your stuff out, and I was like, man, we got to get Lantz on here and chat. So thanks for being here.
Man, Sean, I'm honored to be here and serve those listening. Thank you.
So let's just hop right into it. My big focus a lot of times when I go into companies is sort of separating management versus leadership. And one of the ways that I like to frame that is, we manage the position, we're managing tasks, we're managing outcomes, but we're leading the person, right? Like leadership is a uniquely human construct. And you have this, your whole business is really been around wholehearted leadership. So not just leading the other whole person, but, leading self-leadership from a whole person perspective. Can you kind of, tell everyone about what your perspective is there?
Sure. I don't know about you, Sean, but some mornings, even similar to today, you think things are going to go one way, but even trying to get this podcast done, I've had to make about 4 different adjustments this morning. And that leaves me feeling a little bit fragmented. Some people would call it anxiety. But right, you take that into a more macro level or even a global level of like our world is a broken and hurting world. And the reality is most of us are in a relationship and leadership intimacy crisis, meaning that I think we're all trying to do our best to show up with our whole heart each day. But man, things are pulling at us in a million different ways, whether it's our marriage, our kids, our occupation, and even trying to figure out how do I have some hobbies and friends in the midst of that. And so it leaves us feeling, going back to what I said, leaves us feeling fragmented of like, how do I really show up as a whole person day in and day out? And so that's really the posture of my own story and the posture that I try to serve people. Is that like if you can show up wholehearted, I think there's going to be a lot more fruit that comes from that effort.
When I mentioned your story, how did you first notice, what were those symptoms to help you come to that realization that you weren't showing up as your whole self, or, there were parts of your life that you were not showing up as your whole person? Like, what was that experience? Like, what were those early indicators that was happening?
One story, because I think I'm in process of becoming. I don't know if I've arrived, but one in particular story comes to mind. Years ago, I had jumped out of my executive leadership role, and God led us on a wilderness journey that I thought, like, oh, here we go. This thing's going to be amazing, and we're going to climb to the top of the mountain, see the view. It's going to be wonderful, right? But it turned into just a very, very, very difficult season. And so one moment that I realized like I was fragmented as a person was when my wife and I were doing a 6-hour Enneagram audio version, driving to West Texas and then back home to North Dallas. My wife had discovered her number at the end of this 6-hour audio version of this Enneagram teaching. And I look over and there's tears like streaming down her face because like we're in the middle of a very difficult season. And in that moment, I realized like, man, this is the first time that I've actually seen my wife. Like, right. It's easy to feel like you're connecting until that other person breaks and they're vulnerable in a way that's like, man, somebody actually sees me because you haven't been seeing me. Meaning that like everything's gonna be all right. It's gonna turn out great. Like, right. But all she was really asking for all along the way is like, what is the structure? What is the plan? And how are we going to get there? And my posture was like, I don't know. We're going to just take this one day at a time. And so I realized in that season, I hadn't been leading with my whole heart because she was asking for one thing and I was delivering something completely opposite of what she actually needed. And this is true in any environment, whether it's our marriage or the work environment. It's like, how many times is my ego in the way and I'm going full steam ahead, leaving people behind? But the reality is, like, nobody's actually following me. So I think that's what we have to be aware of, is that, like, okay, am I pushing ahead, or am I actually bringing other people along?
And in your mind, did you feel like you guys were connected and communicating and open and on the same page? Like, or, did, in your mind, was that a realization that that wasn't occurring? Or was that a new realization? Like,
Yeah, from the outside in, I mean, we were connected, great marriage, like, right, things were good. But I think emotionally, we were just swimming in the shallow end, like, because it was just a really, really hard season, um, like survival season, check is in the mail type of story season. And so when you're living out of that lizard brain of survival, when you're living out of that anxious and fragmented pieces of yourself, um, unfortunately, it leaves you in a position not to make long-term decisions in a reasonable way, because you're just making daily decisions, right? So I've really learned and tried to position myself since then as, like, okay, what is it that I really want, like, a decade from now? And, like, how do I go back and begin to live in the day based on that preferred vision? Because going back to the Enneagram, I'm Enneagram 9, and in general, they have a great way of making other people shine, and making their visions and dreams come to life, but have a very difficult way of speaking up for my desires, wants, and needs. And so that left me a void of a person, um, because I've realized that I've had to grow up and learn what assertive communication looks like, to go after what I want, instead of leading in a democracy type of way, consensus type of way. And there's times for that, but I also know that people value my voice and they want to know my voice, and so I've had to learn to speak up, because people are looking for a leader, not necessarily just somebody to keep the team together. Kumbaya, as my wife would say at the table, you know.
yeah, it is, man, I feel like a lot of businesses that I see and work with, there's a lot of leaders I think that struggle with, especially nowadays. It's almost this pendulum of maybe, a few decades ago, the thought that a great boss or a great leader was the let's go push, maybe even like yell or be super aggressive, or like be all, it's all about me. We're all going to do this, and be like, and like almost too much. Right. Like, and almost turn people off and not listen. And then it's like, no, we need to, now it's this pendulum swing back where a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to be like that. Right. And so I'm going to go the other way. And then they end up in, meeting after meeting talking about, well, what is that? What do you think? What do you think? And like, everyone's like, well, someone just make a decision and like go. And, but I don't know if I don't think there's a lot of, I know there's not a lot of training out there for people to find that balance that you're talking about, like when you work with clients and leaders, how do you help them find that balance between, as we would say in the military, when in charge, take charge, along with, getting people on board, getting buy-in, and eliciting, information and feedback to make the best decision.
I think if what I'm hearing you ask is this idea of, like, how do you allow somebody, uh, to be assertive and aggressive, and lead. Um, I guess what's coming to mind is that you have to be willing to tolerate a level of discomfort of staying connected in a relationship and being, seen as possibly wrong, and still making a decision to move forward. So what I mean is that in my role serving executive leaders, the number one or two person oftentimes is that they are extremely good at people pleasing, right? Because there's this subconscious narrative playing out for a lot of high performing leaders that we're trying to prove someone wrong from our past history and our past story, whether it's our mom, whether it's our dad, whether it's our brother. And so that leaves us in a very weak position, because the next thing you know, we actually climb the ranks by people pleasing, not actual leadership. And so the higher you get in different rooms you get in, the next thing you know, you're called upon to be a leader, not just a people pleaser. And that toleration of knowing how to hold on to relationships and still making a courageous decision is really left for very, very few leaders, because it hurts. Like, right, it hurts to see a team member not quote unquote like us, but it would be much better to be respected, say the hard things, say the truthful things filled with grace, in a way that it's like, hey, you know what? I'm trying to stay emotionally calm as I can. I'm going to stay connected in this relationship, but I'm also going to make a courageous decision based on our preferred future. And it's okay if you disagree with it, but this is what we have to do right now based on our current circumstances.
Yeah, I noticed when I was, looking at your content and reading more about you in preparation for this, that you had a line where you said, I couldn't keep everyone happy. That you were struggling. It makes sense now. You mentioned your Enneagram 9, so I'm like, oh, okay, it started to come together now. But I think as you mentioned, a lot of leaders struggle with that. I mean, but is it our responsibility to make other people happy? Is it even possible for us to be responsible for somebody else's happiness?
No, absolutely not. I mean, uh, the beauty of leadership, I think, between marriage and raising kids is the best ecosystem that we can grow up as leaders if we're willing to actually know what's happening, right? Because your home environment is the greatest leadership environment, and it's going to test your sense of resolve and your ability to move a team from point A to point B. And so what I mean by that is, like, I have a 14-year-old daughter, uh, who probably is modeling some of my tendencies. Firstborn, right? Trying to figure out, like, how do I navigate making mom and dad happy. But something that we say oftentimes in our home is you're not responsible for your friends' emotions, and that is super difficult. Like, you're just responsible for your emotions. Your emotions are not right or wrong, um, and your emotions can't control you either. You have to be aware of it. Say, you know what, I feel disconnected from you, but what I'm going to choose to do instead of withdrawing from this awkward conversation, the hard conversation, is believe the best about you, believe the best about our team, and work through the conflict that we need to currently uh, work through. And so I think, as team members, we have to be emotionally aware, is really what this comes down to. And I think that's my approach to just this idea of wholehearted leadership, is that most leaders in general have a very low ceiling when it comes to emotional capacity, or what some people would call emotional intelligence, right? Um, so we're really good at like anger. We're really good at, probably some boardrooms, dropping the F bomb and storming out the door. But really, like, how do you be the calmest person in the room and still continue to lead people? In my process, I truly believe that one of the best ways that leaders can do that is learn what it means to be a coaching leader, what it means to be a thoughtful leader that asks questions. Sometimes they're directive questions, but sometimes they're just questions that bring out other people's beliefs, values, and motives.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned, yeah, you use the term emotional capacity, and you said, other people might say emotional intelligence. Why do you use the term emotional capacity instead of emotional intelligence? Are they different concepts to you, or?
Man, I think I may be selling myself short. I don't think men want to talk about emotions. And let's be honest, I think when we talk about emotional intelligence, and whatever EQ test you want to take out there, it's like, what is emotional intelligence? Like, how do you know when somebody's emotionally intelligent? Like, I don't know. Like, right? I think we're all in the process of maturations and growing and becoming. But I think the more that you're able to sit in your own discomfort, in your own silence, in your own solitude, uh, grows your emotional capacity, if that makes sense. So like, right, we can take an emotional intelligence test or assessment, whatever it may be, and that's just data. Like, we don't need more data. People actually need to figure out how to get in touch on a heart level with one another that makes you feel seen and makes me feel seen and makes us feel like we actually belong in this environment together. And that's the real hard work of leadership, because if I go back to, that's the season that led us into our hard season. Essentially, I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was making a move out of faith, and I think the move was out of faith. But underneath the surface, I was really afraid. There was this subconscious story now that I'm aware of like I was living in a sense of fear, that I was the next person on the chopping block. But the reality is, because I was living in a sense of fear and I couldn't have the courageous conversation, and I lived out of a posture of passive aggressiveness, it I self sabotaged the whole fear scenario anyway, right? And so I think some of it's just like, okay, what is actually going on, right? We all have secret fears that we're wrestling with. We all have secret dreams that we're wrestling with, and the more that we can see each other on that human level, beyond any EQ test, I think our organizations and our homes will fly much better off.
Yeah, and when I hear you talking about is the terms that come to mind when you mention that are creating basically this is a buzz term, but psychological safety and also an environment for like vulnerability. And so as leaders, we want to do that. We want to connect human to human, but we're not sure how. So when you coach the executives to create that environment or have that conversation and connect, how do you coach them to approach that?
Perfect question, and a great time to ask this. So I have a new leader in a well-known national organization. He's just transferred into a new store as their owner, and we worked through this idea of like everybody's perception of you is the leader, is the quote unquote boss, and we were working through like, how do you set up the culture that you actually want through a sense of vulnerability and authenticity. And so actually last week in one of our coaching conversations, we talked through like, your stories actually need to be stories of failure that they hear, and how God has redeemed those stories, whether they're a parenting story or a workplace story, because the more that people see you in your moment of weakness, your moment of darkness, all of a sudden they're able to connect to you. It's really hard to connect with people who are on top of the mountain. But when you lead from this place of like, hey, yes, I am the leader. We are going in this vision. We are going in this direction. But let me tell you about a time that I really screwed it up with my wife. Let me tell you about a time that I really screwed it up when I fired this team member, and then 3 months later I realized I shouldn't have fired him. I fired the wrong person. I think the more that we share those stories, it makes us human. And I think too often there's this false perception that leaders know it all. And so I think that's what we're trying to really dismantle, is not being the know-it-all, or myself, the self-righteous eldest brother that stays at home, right, and doesn't know the goodness of God. And so I think that's really what it's trying to come down to, is like, how do you walk with a position of humility and strength at the same time?
I love that you said, humility and strength, because there is strength in vulnerability, right? And that it's, as you know, it's way harder to admit those mistakes and be vulnerable and do like that. That it takes more courage than trying to, present the perfect facade, the infallible person. And I know I had the same thing. I early in my career, my first business failed, and I went through bankruptcy. I lost my money. I lost other people's money. I had to start over. And as I started putting more content out and talking about leadership, my business coach mentioned, he's like, well, no, you should bring up the fact that you had a failed business and you started over. And it was scary. I was like, I don't know if I want to share. Like, then they're not going to want to work with me. They're not going to, trust me. They're not going to. And to your point, the complete opposite was true. As soon as I said, especially around other entrepreneur, business owners, senior executives, as soon as you say, had my bankruptcy, they all just like, oh yeah, we've been there. Like everyone else is like, oh, you did it too. Like, it's just almost this And you did see those walls come down. And so I love the fact you're bringing up the importance of leading by example. And when you're vulnerable, giving that gives permission to everyone else to be vulnerable with you as well.
Sure. I think one of the things that we as a culture are struggling with, and especially public facing leaders, is that, call it a pretentious environment, call it a perfectionistic environment, uh, is that we're all walking around with a sense of like, I've got to keep it all together and it all rests upon me, right? Whether at home or at work again. But the reality is, like, life is not perfect, right? Going back to the beginning part of our conversation, the more that we can realize like life is difficult, and all of us are doing the best we can probably, and give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, I think it creates, going back to what you said, like, I think it creates a level of safety and a level of trust. Like, when we don't feel like we have to show up perfect in an organizational environment, that we can just show up and figure out, like, okay, what does organizational health look like today, and how can I best serve you as being a part of the team member?
Yeah, it's totally true. And as you work and talk with leaders and help them, create those environments at work and in their organizations. How do you mentioned before that about them when they're at home and having that be sort of like the ultimate leadership laboratory or opportunity. So how are those two things connected? And do you say, if you have a leader who's maybe leading from fear and leading from scarcity, is it okay, let's make sure we fix you, then we'll work on home, then we'll work on business? Is it let's work with business and then reflect back to you? Like, what's the like where do you start, in your mind, to help that leader start to create the right environment for themselves and others?
Well, I start where they want to start. I had a guy reach out yesterday, because adult learning theory shows that you are going to help people grow at where they want to currently grow, right? And so, this part owner of a company reached out yesterday. He's like, "Hey, I want you to serve me and my team for all of 2025." And we talked through all the buckets, right? Because I don't think there's a place that you start. Like, right, growth is not linear. Oftentimes, just the way that I market my own pain points from a business perspective, guys often come to me because of their marriage, right? As business owners who are disconnected from their marriage. But the reality is that we'll work on that for one or two conversations. And the next thing you know, the next three conversations are about the team meeting and some feedback forms that they're trying to work on to assess the health of their team as we close out the end of 2024. And so it really becomes this integrated approach versus this linear aspect that I take, or some people take in terms of executive coaching. Um, yeah, it'd be great to say, hey, here's a 2-year playbook, and if you do the mission vision first, and if you do the values, and then we're going to get to component 3, and everything's going to be humming. But I truly believe, and this comes from Edwin Friedman and some of his work, that all the decisions that we make as leaders are emotion based decisions. And so the more that we can wrestle with that reality, and the more that we can understand like all the emotions that are at play in these decisions, uh, the better that growth actually happens. And so, to go back to your question, I don't think growth is linear. So I start where that person is willing to start, which is complicated from a business perspective, because I think it would be easier to give a guy a 2-year playbook because there's a lot of safety and structure in giving somebody a 2-year playbook. But I mean, some of my guys have been with them for 2 or 3 years, right? Because I know that we're growing them as an entire person, not just one little facet of their business. And so if they want, a scalpel for their business, right? If they want somebody to work on the website or work on something on the back end of the Excels and data, is like, sure, go get that person, go hire that person. But I'm not that person.
Yeah, I think that's the art and science and the balance what I've seen in terms of coaching as well, right? Like it is it would be so much easier, and it's tempting sometimes. And sometimes I've had, clients, that's what they want, right? They're like, well, where's the workbook? Where's step one? Where's step two? And you're just like, let's, it's like, oh, every coaching engagement is a custom it's a custom thing because that person is a unique individual. Um, and like I said, so it's a little bit of art and science, which, made me think about, because I'm a huge proponent as well, that one of the keys is bringing and training leaders on coaching and developing others. And I think we, in a lot of ways, judge great leaders on the leaders they create. And I think developing other humans is a key component and almost a definition of leadership. So, we're professional coaches. We've had training and years of experience on how to do this. But when you want to help a leader start to bring some aspects of coaching and development into their organization, like how do we help leaders bring coaching and a coaching friendly environment or culture into the company?
I think some of my greatest opportunities for that have been with my guys that I've actually served for a while. Meaning that once they know what coaching is, and I'm asking thoughtful, strategic questions that bring out their own level of growth, their own level of awareness, they're like, oh, I've been a know-it-all leader or a transactional leader. I've been the person that is command and obeyed leader, right? And so the more that I'm actually with somebody, that they start to hunger for implementing coaching inside the organization. And so that's why, next year is going to be a phenomenal year just for me from a personal perspective in business coaching, is that some of these guys are like, hey, I'm ready to start training our team on this art of coaching. But that goes back to the capacity to be a wholehearted leader is your willingness to like serve the person in front of you, listen in such an intentional way that you can ask a question after they're done talking. Because I don't know about you, Sean. I mean, like in general, like I don't walk away from hardly any conversations that somebody's like, "Hey, Lance, really, like, tell me more about that." Huh? That must have felt weird or awkward for you. What was that about? Like, right? People don't know how to serve other people just with questions. Um, in fact, I have to be super aware that I don't get frustrated in relationships. My wife and I will walk away from conversations like, "Did that person ask you any questions at all?" Like, no. Like people as you're talking are only thinking about themselves in as much as what they want to interject and possibly even one up you in your story. Uh, but I think if we can just be human with each other and serve people out of a posture of questions, then um, it goes back to fruitfulness. But I would say the caveat with that with Sean is that I have to be aware of making myself known and seen in a conversational style. I'm like, oh, this reminds me of a time that I was hurt and disappointed too. And then briefly interject a story that shows a little bit of empathy based on whatever that person is saying. It can't be just question, 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 right? But I think I'm learning in this season of like I have to be aware of just connecting nuances of my story with them. That's also still serving the greater good of that overall conversation.
I love that. I do think uh, some of the best I think some of the best times that I've developed as a coach have been during trainings or working with other coaches or listening to other coaching sessions, right? Like it's I think it's a very hard skill to kind of went before, like, here's step one of coaching, do this, then ask this, then do that. It's like, it's so much better to almost like from a meta learning experience where you're just like watching it or being a part of it happening. And then you almost start to understand it experientially as opposed to just like intellectually.
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, it's funny you say that from a training perspective, and even going back to whoever's listening that's trying to figure out how to do coach training. Right, I'm at PCC level with the International Coaching Federation, but when I started some of the coaching, I thought it was a technical skill, and when I got my first feedback from some of my recordings, they're like, it's just void of like emotion. And I was like, well, some of the training just made it seem like we weren't supposed to pay attention to emotions. And they're like, well, that's higher level coaching. Like, right, you're learning the fundamentals right now. which goes back just to my training in marriage and family therapy, that I was kind of relieved the further that I've got into coaching, that coaching the whole person is really a beautiful thing, because you're not coaching the problem. And I know you've heard that, and other people have heard that, is that you're not trying to fix their problem. You're actually helping them become aware of what does this say about you? Like what's the real struggle for you right now based on what you just said? Right. So you're always trying to bring the question back to them in a way of like, okay, what is this really about? You're talking about Katie and being, pissed off at her. Uh, but what does that say about you? So, I mean, and then even like, right, if we're in a coaching conversation right now, I'd be like, well, Sean, what was that noise about? Like, what was that insight about?
Yeah. Yeah. To notice that, because it is, well, and I was just reflecting back to, my ICF training and the power of those questions and the power of being present and sitting with that person and ignoring, like that second channel communication, like you were talking about, right? Like trying to formulate the response before they're even done, and then you're not really listening. And I think that, to me, that is a skill I think has to be constantly honed. At least for me, it's something I have to constantly work on and catch myself. And is a powerful tool or realization to bring forward to someone to help them be a better coach. Is just almost like meditation allows you to be more mindful and aware of how your mind and your thoughts and emotions are taking you in a direction unintentionally, the same way that being intentional with coaching and listening and recognizing, like, I'm thinking about the next thing I'm going to say, or I'm thinking about whatever else, why this person's talking. Like, I'm not actually listening to you wholeheartedly. I think that right there is like, that is almost that's have such a critical and powerful aspect, because even if you're not trying to coach, I think leaders, leaders listening is another powerful skill that sort of separates managing from leading, if you
Yeah,
will.
yeah, 100%, 100%. Well, Sean, as you're sharing, like, I think sometimes like it's just important to say, like, what is this conversation right now? Like, I'll do that with, the guys that I've been with for a long time. They're like, hey, I want some quick advice. Let's just work through this. I actually just want to hear all of your thoughts. Like, right. And even in the context of our home and our marriages, it's like important to be like, okay, what is this conversation right now? Like, are you wanting me to help you to resolve something, or are you just wanting me to sit here and listen? And just putting that container and that structure on trying to understand how you can best listen and serve that person in front of you.
Probably my most powerful clarifying question in my marriage has been that exact one. Like, okay, here's what do you want from me right now? Because I want to be. It's like, are you wanting to solve? You want my input on this, or you want me to like just listen and and be there for you and support you? Because like I'm fine with either. But man, especially as men, we immediately go to start solving problems and fixing things, and that's not always what people are looking for.
That's a whole nuanced conversation there too.
Well, let's have it. I mean, I think that's an important one. I mean, I and talk about failures. I mean, I'm in my second marriage. Looking back, I should not have gotten into my first one, and subconsciously knew I shouldn't have. Did it anyway. A lot of factors went into that decision as I reflected on it. One of which was I had just gotten back from a very violent deployment to Afghanistan, and my head space was not was not right. And so, making big decisions when you're not centered has these long lasting consequences. But then I made a litany of other, mistakes as a husband, right? And now as I moved into my, to my current marriage, which we've been married for over 5 years now, we're expecting our first child, baby boy, coming in January. Just and I'm not going to say like everything's perfect, but it's such a different experience because I got to bring some of those lessons, those mistakes, in terms of like listening and being there, not just, especially for me being in the military and just being really busy and focused at work. I took that same like go, solve the problem, move on to the next thing, shoot, move, communicate into my marriage. And my God, that's not the right approach.
Yeah, 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 yeah. What do you suppose it's been growing up inside of you, like between the first marriage and the second marriage?
I think there was a lot of reflection of how did I get here? Right. Like, cause, it was also coming up through the military at West Point. It was like, for the most part, win, work hard. If things got hard, or challenging, the answer is just keep moving, right? The answer is just go harder, push harder, right? Try harder, do more. And at some point, the mission's going to end. At some point, the deployment's going to end. And then, but in life, unlike in the military, there's no upper command saying, okay, time to rest and refit. There's nobody looking over you telling you time to do that. And so I had developed and honed in my ability to push through and ignore physical, emotional, spiritual discomfort to a point where I was more than capable of breaking myself. And then when you in that marriage, I didn't have the skills, and even in my first business, I think that was contributing to it as well. I hadn't developed the self-awareness and skills and the ability to regulate my performance and my mentality over the long haul, right? And so just running myself into the ground.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. It sounds like you kind of had maybe you could describe it as a similar experience when you sort of had your realization and that that you were heading down the wrong road and that you were where you were pushing too hard without self-awareness. Or do you see that?
No, yeah, 100%. Because one, it's true in my story, but two, it's statistically true for men. Say 35 to 55. People call it a midlife crisis, but it's really just being emotionally stunted. Like, and you're gonna bulldoze through to try to figure out whatever this transitional season is, and this identity reformation really is about. And so I think traditionally we think like, oh, let me go reach out to a counselor to figure out like how to move forward, right? But I think the nuanced thing about the coaching paradigm and why people are being drawn to it in this particular season is that it is about fostering a more resilient spirit that allows you to go forward. Like, right, it only does so much good for me to be aware of my parents' divorce and that story, and how that story has hurt me and how that story has served me. What's important is how I use that story to move into the future and reframe that story and saying, you know what? Like, I'm building a new generational tree. Like, I'm building a new legacy. But I think even some of this goes back to most people have no idea what they want. Like, right, we talk about dreams and visions, but then we get suckered into this idea like, well, I just got to wake up, go to work, come home, you know, do the laundry, feed the kids, and then go to sleep and wake up and do it again. But I think the more that people wrestle with, like, okay, what is it that I really want, and for the greater good of human flourishing, and then use your assignment to walk out that calling, your life begins to expand in a much more spacious way. But I was going back to that season, like I was scared, I was small minded, I was living in a very small story. I wasn't I wasn't expanding my own capacity to really think that I had agency in this situation to either choose to leave out of the organization in a healthy, thoughtful way, or agency to be able to change the organization. And so I think when we would lose a sense of agency, we're actually ending up playing in these smaller wound stories that all of us have in life. Uh, and so the difference for me, that's like why I don't do therapy, is like because 80% of therapists think that talking about that story is going to solve your future narrative. But coaching in general is a lot more solution focused, and empowering of like, how do you want to live a more spacious um, life?
Yeah. What does fulfillment look like to you in the future? And I think you come from such a unique background because you had that, uh, family and like marriage therapy background. Tell me if I'm wrong on your
Right.
background, but you had that background, then moved into coaching, and so of those two, one like you're mentioning being sort of past focused to explain the present, and then coaching being more defining the present or defining where the future, recognize and then establishing the present and then creating a path forward. Is that how you view it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like a valid question, right? If you were taking the posture of a coach, um, like in your painful military season and divorce, how does some of those emotions today allow you to move forward, right? So it's not negating any of Sean's story, any of his pain, but it's just trying to reframe the question in such a way that you see it in a way that it actually serves your future story versus continuing to hinder you in a victimization mindset.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, because I have this one of the concept how I like to frame in my head is the locus of control, right? Internal versus external locus of control, and so many people are living in that external locus of control of attribution to things that happen to them, to the people around them, to the people in their relationships, or they're living in the past or future, which we can't control either one. And so bringing those lessons and recognizing that the only reality is the present moment, and it's also the only thing we can control. That takes so much work. It takes so much work to do it.
Well, the first thing I would tell anybody is like just turn off the news. Like I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on. Like they have sold us a lie of this huge mentality of we're all victims, versus trying to empower us with a sense of freedom and responsibility. And so just like even going back to my marriage and family therapy days, I'm thankful for one of my professors. She was like, I would encourage all of you. I mean, this was, man, almost 20 years ago, 16, 18 years ago. She's like, I'd encourage all of you to just stop watching the news. She's like, the amount of stories that you're going to hear and your tolerance as a person can only hear so much crap in life. And so like, right. Like, and so I think that's one way to grow up our emotional center is like pay super close attention to what's actually going inside of us, right? And this is something I'm guilty of, and I use an excuse right now, like, well, I got to have social media to grow a business. And it's like, well, how can you grow a coaching practice without social media? Like, that's the question I'm asking myself. And so the more that I ask myself that question, puts me in a position of empowerment versus thinking as social media. As this bad nemesis is like, okay, I'm empowered to figure something out. Like how can I grow this thing without it? If I had to, what would I do? You know?
They're hitting some points close to home for me too, because I have like a newsy political person, dude, and within the I don't remember exactly. It was maybe 6 months ago or something. Uh, I deleted the Apple News app on my phone. And I was probably, I don't know how many people do this. I was paying a subscription to Apple to get all the news, right? Like I was paying to have more news put on my phone, and I would scroll, I wasn't like a doom scroller on Instagram or stuff. I would just read the news, and man, you think people doom scroll Instagram or TikTok, try doom scrolling the news, man. It's like straight to the vein. Sensationalism, everything's falling apart. Civil war's coming. Prepare, like it's and eventually I deleted the whole app off my phone about 5-6 months ago, because I was just like, I can't do this. And the lie I told myself, or the story I told myself was, in order to be a responsible citizen, we have to be informed. And of course, there's a grain of truth to that, right? Like there's a grain of truth to like, and I consider myself a strong patriot, and I consider myself, not that we're a perfect country by any stretch, but I've been to a lot of other places in the world, and we're pretty blessed, and it's special. And I do think that citizens have a responsibility to continue that within the country. But I was telling myself the story that meant I had to be attached to the 24-hour news cycle. And can you challenge that and say, well, how can I support that? Can I be an informed citizen? Can I be responsible? And without that, right? Like that, challenging that assumption.
What have you noticed that has shifted in your emotional capacity now versus 5-6 months ago?
I am much more centered. I'm much more present. And I feel like more space, I guess, emotionally, without sort of that background tension, that background anxiety. And intellectually, what I found is that 98% of all the things that you would have to read, that I have to be informed about, like I have no ability to control, right? Like I could do nothing about it. And two, when it was, whether it was something I could vote, I needed to vote on, or I could be more civically active about, most of it just went away into the ether, right? It was a sensationalist story of the day, and it's not going to matter in 3 months. It's not, it's not an existential crisis to our way of life every day, the way that it starts to make you feel that it is.
100%. Yeah, that's good.
Man, I feel like we could do this for hours. I appreciate the conversation. This was a really great episode, and I think unique in the different conversations I've had to give people a sense of what a coaching mindset is. And I think you really blessed them with that. So I really appreciate that today.
Well, my pleasure, Sean. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely, man. Well, I hope to catch up soon.
All right. Blessings.